Hello, this is Governor Lewis.
Perfect. Thank you. I can hear and see you great.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. And for all our witnesses today, you can just remain muted and camera off until you give testimony. Thank you.
How you doing?
Just chilling, man.
You have a good sleep?
Huh?
You have a good sleep?
Do you have everything you need?
Which, you told me yesterday the second bill was a problem, but it looks like the first bill is too.
So the Tribal Property on Public Lands Act is specifically about, native Hawaiians are included, but it doesn't really affect us.
This one
Yeah, based off of,
are included?
they're not included, but it doesn't really affect us.
Why?
The way the HHL is set up and kind of the land things, it's specifically talking about BLM and forestry land.
Good.
And this is the one.
That's the main one. Yeah.
And you've had conversations with the,
I've had conversations with the Parks staff is very, very willing to work with us about it. And I was just talking to Laura about it, so committee leadership understands too.
well, if they said that's why we're gonna go through this, because this is just the first hearing.
Yeah, and it was just an oversight and drafting process.
We're talking softballs today, Case. Softballs.
What's that?
We're talking softballs. Just
Softballs.
Yeah,
I will
slow.
try to be soft.
Man. Soft for cases. Different than soft for me. Way different. Way different.
I just wanna come down here and hear your bills, hear about your bills.
I'm gonna be real quick on that part. And then just kind of leave it to questions, because we have. Say hello.
Sorry, I didn't
Just for what?
talking. You have your coffee? You
I'm good.
Okay.
Nat. Hey, Henry. I gotta need to say this woman's name. I don't want to butcher her name. How do you say it? Phonetically.
I have let me grab it. I have it on a sheet.
Do you have trouble with acronyms, or am I the only one? When it's
What?
NACPRO or NACPRO, and then it's like an
NACPRO.
acronym with an 8
Saying
letter.
it. You mean just saying it?
Yeah.
Yeah, NACPO.
Mm. Asipola? Asipola. Asi.
Thank you, sir.
What's your name?
Sir, Kanan.
Raul.
Nice to meet you.
Canaan. He's all over this stuff.
He's the one with the soft questions, huh? Shit. Can't control the staff, you know that. I think Nagu's in a bad mood today. Traveler.
He looks like he's in pretty good.
Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands will come to order. Subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on 3 bills relating to tribal co-management. Under Committee Rule 4, subparagraph F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Members physically present should provide a hard copy for staff to distribute by email. Please note that members are responsible for their own microphones, and as with our fully in-person hearings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. Thank you to everyone for being here today for this subcommittee hearing. This hearing continues the committee's efforts throughout the last 2 Congresses to elevate the role of Indigenous peoples in the management of their ancestral lands. I want to thank our esteemed panel for joining us today to share their expertise on this important work. I think the breadth of knowledge captured by our panel, which includes representatives of 2 federal departments, although I know I'll speak to one of those federal departments' appearance at the hearing today in a moment, an elected tribal chair from Arizona, a tribal historic preservation officer from Florida, and the president of the largest indigenous organization, a former chairwoman herself, speaks to the growing recognition across the government and indeed across the country that these issues are essential and they must be considered. Indigenous communities are the original stewards of the lands that we now know as the United States. For thousands of years, they've called these lands home, hunting, fishing, building communities and cultures, practicing various religions, and coming to know these places intimately. I think the chair of our distinguished committee, Mr. Grijalva, put it so well in our March full committee hearing on co-management that ultimately we must and can take steps to acknowledge history of Indigenous peoples here in our country and to respond to the pressing challenges that face those communities. I believe the bills and issues that we are considering today are an important effort to do just that. These 3 items, all sponsored by our chairman, Mr. Grijalva, the esteemed gentleman from Arizona, represent a major step forward in expanding the role that Indigenous communities can and should play in the management of their ancestral lands. These bills help set the stage for the work that should be done now while establishing a clear path for the committee to follow in the future. I am delighted that we have the opportunity to be able to hear these 3 bills, and again, very grateful to Chairman Grijalva for bringing the bills forward to this committee. While I recognize that we won't agree on all the issues before us, I think it's significant that there's common ground in acknowledging this past history, and I hope that we can find space to address the same here today during the hearing. With that, I'm going to yield the balance of my time, and I will turn to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, just a welcome to all of our witnesses that are joining us today. We're looking forward to your testimony, and thank you so much for being here. During the past 6 weeks, I've had the great privilege of being back home in my own state of Idaho, traveling throughout my district and listening to concerns raised by my constituents. A common theme I heard from them was the difficulty of living in a state with such a large federal footprint. Now, Idaho, like much of the West, is choked off with smoke due to catastrophic wildfire right now. It's a result of poor federal forest management, and local communities have few new economic opportunities as a result of that, particularly when so much of the federal land within Idaho's borders are locked away from wise management or multiple use. Unfortunately, federal regulations tourism, but also associated destruction of the very tribal sites that the monument was originally supposed to preserve. Earlier this year, the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition shared photos of vandalism to sacred cultural sites and said these destructive incidents have been on the rise and have been a regular occurrence in Bears Ears. Drawing large circles on a map has not protected the area, and there's been no increase in resources or law enforcement presence. This bill would also allow the agencies to lock up millions of acres of land without receiving congressional approval, similar to the Antiquities Act. Locking up large swaths of federal land contradicts the multiple-use mandate of the federal land management agencies who are charged with balancing various uses such as energy development, timber harvesting, outdoor recreation, and grazing. These multiple uses are important to enhancing tribal economic opportunities, as we heard from witnesses representing the Intertribal Timber Council and the Southern Ute Tribe earlier this year during an oversight hearing on tribal management. Another bill on today's hearing, H.R. 8719, would designate thousands of acres as new national conservation and wilderness areas in Arizona. This bill would make it much more difficult to eradicate invasive species like bufflegrass, which Chair Grijalva recently said was a fuel for wildfire, a threat to biodiversity, a threat to species, and a threat to the landscape that we all love and cherish. We cannot lose sight of the fact that when we designate new lands as wilderness from Washington, D.C., 1,000 miles from where those lands are actually located, it has real-life consequences. Just a few months ago, the subcommittee held a hearing on Representative Fazio's Wild Road Conservation and Recreation Enhancement Act, which seeks to create nearly 60,000 acres of new wilderness. That same area is now burning as we speak in the Rum Creek Fire, which Oregon Governor Kate Brown declared as an emergency. People across the West deserve to have their agencies increase the management of their lands, not impede management through restrictive designations. What may look good on paper thousands of miles away looks a lot different through smoke-infested flames on site. I hope today's discussion will be about how to properly balance land management objectives, promote self-determination for Indian tribes, and responsibly manage our natural resources rather than placing more restrictions on millions of acres of public land and adding more burden to a broken system. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'd like to turn now to our witnesses. Before introducing them, I'll remind non-administration witnesses that they are encouraged to participate in the Witness Diversity Survey that was created by the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Witnesses may refer to their hearing invitation materials for further information. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will begin. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there is 1 minute left, and then red when the time has expired. For any members and witnesses joining remotely, it'll turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining, and I recommend that you pin the timer so it remains visible. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise, and we'll also allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. The chair now recognizes the distinguished gentleman from Arizona, the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Grijalva.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. Thank you for holding the hearing. And as you said, today is about continuing the work of this committee in particular, under your leadership and the members of this committee throughout this Congress. I'm grateful to the partners who worked with us throughout to plan hearings, to draft legislation, and to make progress on issues like tribal consultation and indigenous land management. This has been a collaborative effort throughout, and the bills before us today are no different. So I want to thank President Sharp on behalf of NCAI, Ms. Osceola, on behalf of the National and Tribal Preservation Officers, and my friend Governor Lewis on behalf of the Gila River Indian community. Your contributions and expertise were essential in crafting this legislation, and we are most appreciative. These three bills before us are quite different, but they all work I think, to achieve one goal: ensuring that the unique knowledge and expertise of indigenous communities is respected and incorporated in the management of federal lands. Whether amending existing law, crafting new programs, or putting new protections on the ground, these bills ensure that tribal governments are front and center in that decision-making process. The Tribal Cultural Areas Protection Act and Advancing Tribal Parity on Public Lands Act are the result of a multi-year collaboration between myself and committee staff, Senator Heinrich, NCAI, the National and Tribal Preservation Officers, tribal attorneys, policy experts, and the Wilderness Society, who I also would like to thank. These bills will ensure that tribal governments get a say in how lands are protected, while ensuring that sacred sites on public lands are not up for sale or desecration. And, you know, unfortunately, the threat to these sites are all too real under the previous administration, and remain so today on public lands across this country. The controversies and struggles around issues like Oak Flat, Chaco Canyon, and even the Grand Canyon are all symptoms of a lack of involvement, a lack of understanding, and a lack of respect for an indigenous perspective that could have helped craft those controversies into something less than controversial. The bills that I think take an important first step to ensuring that these landscapes are protected and are managed as cultural landscapes. The Great Bend of the Gila Conservation Act represents nearly a decade of work to protect a culturally important and ecologically fragile landscape in my home state of in my home in southern Arizona. The bill will protect tens of thousands of acres of new conservation lands and wilderness across the landscape, dotted with petroglyphs, ancient structures and settlements, and other cultural artifacts and monuments. But we've made some important updates to the legislation this Congress to ensure that the 13 tribes with ancestral connections to this landscape have a real voice in its future management. So I want to thank Governor Lewis in particular for appearing today to share his expertise with us and to discuss the importance of these protections. The Gila River community is, through the leadership of the governor and its community, have always been important partners in the issues of management and the issues of our use of our public land and the overall protection of antiquities, cultural resources, and historic resources. Before I close, I also want to acknowledge that this conversation isn't happening in a vacuum. There's work being done across this country by indigenous leaders, tribal communities, and organizations to protect these sacred sites. And I'm happy to say the Biden administration, under the leadership of Secretary Haaland and her team, is taking a leading role in these efforts. From the Native Nations Summit to the reestablishment of Bears Ears, we have been pleased to see that the president and his appointees fully embracing the work of co-stewardship. I'm particularly pleased to see yesterday's announcement that the Biden administration plans to release new guidelines across several agencies on best practices for co-management. This is a major step and will help put these agreements on the ground in the near future. So I want to congratulate and thank our colleagues from the executive branch, my colleague in the Senate, Senator Heinrich, the organizations that I mentioned that have worked with us directly in crafting the legislation, and I look forward to hearing more at today's discussion. With that, again, my thank yous to you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I thank the chairman for his very valuable testimony today. We'll now transition to our second panel. As with the first panel, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be made part of the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start, and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining, and red when your time has expired. The witnesses may proceed to the table. Just one piece of administrative business before we start. Unfortunately, Ms. Sims Hip from the U.S. Department of Agriculture will no longer be able to testify as she is dealing with a medical emergency. We certainly hope that she is okay, and we look forward to continuing to work with her and the USDA on these efforts. With that, the chair will now recognize Mr. Brian Newland, Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs at the Department of Interior, and supported by Mr. Raymond Suazo, Arizona State Director at the Bureau of Land Management.
Ani Buju, good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Brian Newland. I am an Ojibwe citizen of the Bay Mills Indian community, and I have the pleasure and the privilege of serving as the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs at the Department of the Interior. I want to thank the committee, or the subcommittee rather, for the opportunity to present our testimony on H.R. 8108 and H.R. 8109 this morning. And as you noted, Mr. Chairman, we have submitted a statement for the record in support of H.R. 8719, the Great Bend of the Gila Conservation Act, and Ray Suazo from the Bureau of Land Management, who's the Arizona State Director, is accompanying me this morning virtually to help answer questions on that bill, as well as any specific or questions specific to BLM. The legislation before the subcommittee aligns with the administration's work to promote tribal co-management and co-stewardship of federal lands. President Biden committed to strengthening the nation-to-nation relationship with tribes in a presidential memorandum issued his first week in office. The Departments of the Interior and Agriculture built upon the President's commitment with the Tribal Homelands Initiative and through Joint Secretarial Order 3403 to facilitate agreements with tribes to collaborate in the co-stewardship of federal lands and waters. And as the chairman noted just yesterday, the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service released guidance to strengthen the role of tribes in land management. Consultation and collaboration are essential for tribal governments to shape decisions for the protection of sacred places, for ecosystem restoration, and to respond to the climate crisis. The administration affirms that the United States trust and treaty obligations are integral to each department's responsibilities for managing federal lands. And we believe that our efforts to increase tribal collaboration will benefit all Americans. We appreciate the subcommittee's work on the bills under consideration today. H.R. 8108, the Advancing Tribal Parity on Public Lands Act, would prohibit the disposal of land managed by BLM or the Forest Service if the Secretaries of Interior or Agriculture determine, through tribal consultation, that disposal would impact the rights or interests of an interested tribe or impair access to a reservation. The department supports the goals of increasing tribal participation and eligibility in public land laws as proposed in this legislation. H.R. 8108 would amend several laws in order to involve tribes and tribal governments more fully in land use planning efforts and land conveyances, and to prioritize treaty and trust obligations during acquisitions. And that's why the department supports this bill. We defer to the Department of Agriculture regarding the bill's provisions affecting land managed by the Forest Service. H.R. 8109, the Tribal Cultural Areas Protection Act, establishes a tribal cultural areas designation on land under the jurisdiction of the Secretary. The designation would preserve opportunities for Indian tribes to undertake religious, cultural, or traditional practices within tribal cultural sites. And the bill strives to permanently protect the religious, ecological, and traditional values of tribal cultural sites. It's aimed at enhancing opportunities for Indian tribes to engage in the preservation and management of tribal cultural sites on public land. Importantly, H.R. 8109 gives Congress the sole authority to designate areas on public land for inclusion within the tribal cultural area system. The department currently manages other designations that help to conserve the most special areas on public lands. This includes areas designated by Congress or by the President, by the Secretary, or through local land use planning processes. The department manages these areas by respecting the ties that Native and traditional communities have to them and by welcoming diverse interests and uses. H.R. 8109 would provide an explicit designation intended to protect tribal cultural sites that is different from other designations. And this explicit designation would provide clearer tools for tribes and agencies to account for the unique interests of tribes and indigenous people. The department supports the goals of H.R. 8109 to enhance tribal involvement in the protection of important cultural sites. If the bill moves forward, we would be happy to work with the sponsor and with the committee on several issues, such as the best way to achieve the bill's goals without affecting other existing special designations and cultural resource protections. So I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and the subcommittee for our opportunity to testify this morning. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Assistant Secretary. The chair now recognizes the Honorable Stephen Rowe Lewis, Governor of the Gila River Indian Community, who will be joining us virtually, I believe.
Tosh, good morning. Chairman Grijalva, Chairman Negus, Ranking Member Fulcher, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on H.R. 8719, the Great Bend of the Gila Conservation Act. My name is Stephen Rowe Lewis, and I am the governor of the Gila River Indian Community. My community is made up of approximately 23,000 members, and we're located in southern Arizona. Now, H.R. 8719, the Gila Bend of the Conservation Act, the Gila Conservation Act, will provide protection to the Great Bend of the Gila National Conservation Area, the Palo Verde National Conservation Area, and will also designate an additional 60,000 acres as wilderness. The conservation area identified in this legislation are located in the beautiful Sonoran Desert in southern Arizona. And this area contains significant cultural and historical connections, not only for the Gila River Indian community, but for almost half of the tribal nations in Arizona. Tribal nations and Native Americans have resided, existed on these lands since time immemorial. Now, the evidence of this sacred tribal connection to these lands can be found in the petroglyphs, the rock art, archaeological findings of ancient villages, and our traditional irrigation systems. Now, these culturally significant places, such as these, deserve the highest protection. If these areas are vandalized, if sacred places are disrupted, irreversible harm is caused because these areas cannot be replaced. Now, the Great Bend of the Gila Conservation Act would provide necessary protection from harmful economic and infrastructure development to ensure that there is no further disrespectful degradation of the landscape. I know that this committee has reviewed and considered prior versions of this legislation, but there are important distinctions nonetheless in this version of H.R. 8719 that I would like to highlight for the committee. Now, this legislation would create a tribal commission that would include impacted tribal nations who have a historical association with the lands contained within this conservation area. Now, the objective of the Tribal Commission will be to provide traditional, cultural, ecological, and historical knowledge to the Secretary of Interior as Madam Secretary creates a comprehensive management plan for each protected area that would describe the long-term protection and management of each of these areas. Now, in addition to tribal feedback and traditional knowledge, which is essential, the Secretary would also consult with and solicit feedback from the appropriate state and local government, those governmental entities and public stakeholders to develop the management plan. Now, the Tribal Commission and the bill's requirement to incorporate tribal traditional ecological knowledge in the decision-making about how to protect and manage these areas are important because of the enhanced role that tribal nations would play in the management of areas of great cultural and historical significance. Now, this legislation is important in acknowledging tribal nations as critical and essential partners in the management and protection of critical areas connected to our histories. But more important, as stewards of these lands since time immemorial, caretakers We have solutions to protect these lands and to address the impacts of climate on our environment. We've been doing this for generations as the remnants of our sacred irrigation systems located in the conservation areas have shown. This legislation and this hearing offer an important window into the role of tribal nations that they can play in the treatment of our historic areas and caretaking, but also of how we can be partners in co-management of tribal lands and our ancestral lands. Now, in conjunction with this hearing yesterday, the Department of Interior released new guidance that will improve and strengthen tribal co-stewardship of public lands and waters. The guidance acknowledges the nation-to-nation relationship and again brings tribes into the decision-making of how to manage drought, wildfire prevention, watersheds, and wilderness. This is a welcome announcement by the department, especially in Arizona where we're facing the worst drought conditions in over 1,200 years. Tribal nations not only be part of the discussion, but be key decision-making. We have unique, traditional, and historical experiences that we can bring solutions to these long-standing problems. That's why the Gila River Indian community supports H.R. 8719 proudly, the Great Bend of the Gila Conservation Act. We thank Chairman Grijalva for reaching out to the community, for working with us with this bill, and appreciate the opportunity to provide you with other additional general views about this as well. Thank you. Mosafa.
Thank you for your testimony. The chair now recognizes the Honorable Fawn Sharp, President of the National Congress of American Indians and Vice President of the Quinault Indian Nation.
Good morning, Chair Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Fawn Sharp. I serve as Vice President of the Quinault Indian Nation and President of the National Congress of American Indians. On behalf of NCAI, thank you for this opportunity to provide testimony on H.R. 108 and H.R. 109. NCAI fully supports these pieces of legislation as viable ways to increase the protection and parity for tribal nations' sacred and cultural lands. The lands which make up the United States is carved from the historic territories of our tribal nations. And from these land takings exchanges came a unique legal relationship with the federal government, one rooted in treaty rights and the federal trust responsibility. As the nation-to-nation relationship has evolved over time, it's been particularly important and incumbent upon the federal government to protect tribal cultural heritage by preserving American Indian and Alaska Native sacred places, objects, and cultural landscapes. As Native people, we maintain meaningful relationships, religious, cultural, and social connections to our ancestral and historic homelands, including to our cultural and sacred landscapes, regardless of their current status. Both H.R. 108 and H.R. 109 would implement important protections for our sacred and cultural areas and fulfill numerous responsibilities to protect our religious freedoms. NCAI has two resolutions which call upon the federal government to increase protections for our cultural heritage by securing our rights to our culturally relevant landscapes, calling on Congress to fix the gaps in federal law that leave tribal nations without a meaningful voice, and a practical path forward to protect and manage our ancestral landscapes. They also call for tribal nations to have the first opportunity to purchase federal lands they have had a historical relationship when it comes time for disposal or transfer. H.R. 108, the Advancing Tribal Parity on Public Lands Act, would not only ensure that tribal nations have parity with other governments, but that our cultural and religious observances are offered the respect that they so deserve. This bill builds tribal consideration into the federal land acquisition and alienation process, empowering tribal nations with the right of first refusal for their lands. Federal agencies will also be required to consider the presence of cultural sites and the fulfillment of treaty obligations when considering land acquisitions, and prohibits the sale of public lands containing a tribal cultural site. NCAI supports 8108 because the right of land repatriation and protection is at the heart of NCAI. Tribal leaders across the country created NCAI in response to federal termination policies, which threatened tribal sovereignty, our governments, and our territories. This was not simply a matter of securing control or governance, but to protect our sacred and ancestral connections to our land. For these lands, which remain under federal stewardship, our cultural landscapes still require additional protections. Oftentimes, the protection of and access to these sites were guaranteed under treaties, which were never upheld. While Congress has formally recognized the need to protect both American Indian and Alaska religious activities and nationally cultural relevant places, such as in the American Indian Religious Freedom Act and in the National Historic Preservation Act, these laws still leave a gap in the protection of our tribal sacred places. That is why H.R. 8109 is so important. This bill would preserve tribal nations, that we have a vested interest in creating tribal cultural area systems. We as nations would be able to recommend sections of public land to the system and be empowered to manage these cultural sites. We have been protecting and managing our lands for millennia. H.R. 8109 will honor and uphold many of the promises that have been broken. There is merely and rarely a meaningful way to uphold tribal sovereignty than by ensuring tribal nations have a voice in the decisions that will affect our cultural, historical, and sacred landscapes. NCAI strongly supports these bills as both offer the much-needed parity we deserve as sovereign tribal nations. As Congress works to restore the promises made to tribal nations so long ago, we urge you to pass H.R. 8018 and 8009 and secure protections for our lands and our freedoms. Siokwe, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to each of our witnesses for their testimony today, reminding members that Committee Rule 3, subparagraph D, imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions that they may wish to ask of these 3 witnesses. And I'd like to start by recognizing Mr. Grijalva of the great state of Arizona. Mr. Chairman, you are recognized for as long as you would like, but preferably 5 minutes.
I don't think that magic minute extends to where we're at, but thank you for the gesture. I appreciate it. Mr. Assistant Secretary, I was pleased to see yesterday's announcement on that several DOI agencies are issuing guidance on tribal co-management. What will it mean on the ground, this co-management agreements? What will that mean? And how will that guidance shape DOI's engagement with tribal communities?
Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate that. Last fall, Secretary Holland and Secretary Vilsack issued the joint secretarial order on co-stewardship. But I think as members of the subcommittee know, a lot of our public lands are managed on the ground, whether in particular agency units. And so it's important that we take the secretarial directive and make sure that it actually functions on the ground in each of these public lands units. And so the directives yesterday are aimed at doing that and coming from Bureau directors to their teams in the field to make sure that they have clear direction and guidance from their bosses on how they're expected to coordinate with tribes. And so it's the next step in making sure that we're fulfilling the Secretary's directive from last fall's secretarial order.
Thank you. And Madam President, thank you for your testimony and thank you for the work, the ongoing work, and hopefully in the not too distant future we'll be able to present a product of that work in terms of codifying consultation. And I look forward to our continued work on that and thank your staff heartily on my behalf for their contributions. One of the issues, one of the things that's presented on the 2 pieces of legislation that you talked about, that somehow in the process of doing this, that we're taking something away, that prerogatives on that land are being taken away, or for that matter, the essence of what people see as federal land is being taken away. whether it's multi-use argument or the accessibility argument, but that something's being taken away. From the perspective of the organization you represent, how do you respond to that?
Yes. Siok Will, thank you, Congressman, and thank you for your leadership on our continued working relationship to implement consultation, and I truly appreciate your hard work and collaboration leadership on that. With respect to your question, our response to that is land repatriation is something that we have valued. We have historical ties. We may have ceded millions of acres of land through treaty, but we've never relinquished our spiritual connection to those lands. And that spiritual connection that we have is the foundation of our governance, of our teachings, and our way of managing. So when we think about creating opportunities for us to acquire lands, repatriate lands, or empower our voices in how those are managed, it's returning to those cultural ways that have existed for millennia, for thousands of years here in the United States, long before there was a country. And so we bring to this conversation thousands of years of knowledge and wisdom and leadership and guidance, and it only enhances the landscape so that future generations will know what the beauty and treasures of our land were long before there was a country here.
Thank you, and yeah, thank you. Governor, thank you very much, my friend, for joining us on the legislation that you spoke to, the Gila Bend legislation, the great. On that landscape, explain the significance, I think, elaborate from your perspective what it means. You know, Arizona and southern Arizona, the whole state's going through a drought crisis, a water crisis. And when we're talking about this, people, some make the conclusion that there is another priority. But I think there's a relationship between this legislation and drought mitigation and ecological restoration of those areas, particularly the groundwater issue. Can you reflect, from your perspective, what else you see beyond the drought, or to elaborate about what effect this legislation will have on the whole decision-making that has to happen in our state that isn't occurring to deal with this crisis?
Chairman, thank you so much for this. You know, we trace back, as I said, if not millennia, since time immemorial, our sacred connection to what we call our O'odham Juvit, our land, our O'odham Shudud, our water. We consider ourselves caretakers and stewards of this land and natural resources that Mother Earth has gifted to us for our next generation. As you can see, this is one of our managed aquifer recharge sites in the back. And if you can see behind me is my son. And so we are caretakers for these next generations. And for this knowledge that we carry with us, this value system in our culture and our history, you know, we're innovators. We're resilient people. We've had to be since the coming over 500 years of successive waves of colonization. And truly, Congressman, this tribal commission in regards to HR 8719 is unprecedented and historic. To have a tribal commission to provide the guidance for how these lands are co-managed with the federal government. This recognizes tribal sovereignty. This recognizes our traditional ecological knowledge. And when we are at the table, Chairman and members of the committee, we bring solutions. In this historic, the worst drought in over 1,200 years, Chairman, we when given the opportunity, we can bring innovative solutions, and hopefully this is an opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the indulgence.
Of course. The chair now recognizes Ranking Member Fulcher for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question for Mr. Newland, please. Mr. Newland, the administration's testimony submitted through USDA cited there was at least 16 existing statutes and 5 executive orders, secretarial orders, memorandum of understanding that give the USDA and the Department of Interior extensive authority to either collaborate with tribal governments or protect sacred tribal sites. So given the extensive suite of authorities that are already there, does the Department of Interior feel the legislation before us is truly necessary to protect sacred sites or partner with tribal governments on land management issues?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member. As indicated in our testimony, we support the overarching goals of H.R. 8109, and happy to work with the subcommittee and sponsors on refining the language. I'll note from President Sharp's testimony, she remarked that those existing laws do leave a gap when it comes to the protection of tribal cultural resources. And it's often the case that when tribes are working with federal agencies, they have to shoehorn their interests into some of these laws because they don't neatly fit. And so I do believe, Ranking Member, that there's value in having an explicit designation.
Okay, so if I may then, so could you name an area on public land where currently the federal government would not have the authority to act if tribal cultural sites such as Native American human remains or significant archaeological sites were threatened? Can you identify an area where the federal government would not have the ability to act?
Ranking Member, I can't give you an example this morning of any particular area in response to your question.
All right, so that was kind of what I was concerned about, is if we're trying to bring some solutions in search of a problem here. Follow-up question, Mr. Newland. In the findings section of Chair Grijalva's Tribal Cultural Areas Protection Act, it asserts that the federal government has allowed from commercial development and transfer of federal lands that has resulted in the mismanagement and desecration of sacred sites and looting of sacred objects and burial sites. Do you know, or can you tell us how many acres of federal lands were sold or disposed of by Department of Interior last year? And how many of those acres may have included sacred sites or burial sites?
Ranking Member, I believe the number of acres sold in 2021 was over 150,000 acres. I'll have to ask the subcommittee's permission to make sure I follow up and verify, but I believe that's the correct number.
And do you know if any of those acres included sacred sites or burial sites?
I do not. I can't say with any certainty.
If that's something I could ask you to please follow up on, I would be very interested to know the answer to that. I'd like to go to President Sharp before my time runs out. President Sharp, your testimony cites an NCAI resolution on transferring federal lands to tribal trust. In H.R. 8109, the Cultural Tribal Areas Protection Act, it sets up an elaborate process to designate sacred tribal sites on federal lands and would promote tribal management, but ultimately these areas remain under federal ownership. In some ways, this is in conflict with advancing tribal parity on the Public Land Act. And so I just want to clarify, you do support creating new designations for these areas over just the tribal governments having transferred direct ownership to them?
To be clear, tribal nations would prefer that we own lands outright, but we recognize that this is a process of repatriating centuries of land alienation. And so both of these are necessary in order for us to repatriate our lands fully. We know that there's federal interests, we know that there are public interests, and we recognize and value Congress's need to balance those interests. But from our perspective, absolutely, 100% repatriation of lands that were stolen and lost, that is our priority.
Do you see this as a stepping stone towards that over the course of time? Is that your intention?
I would see it as
Supporting this?
a complementary process to an existing framework. We want to exercise governance and be able to have a voice and bring the value. To Congressman Grijalva's point,
Interesting.
Yes, so,
Very interesting. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Hawaii, Mr. Case.
Oops. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Ranking Member, witnesses. Appreciate being with you here this morning. Let me start by saying that I fully support all three of these bills. I completely agree that we do have to take these additional steps, should take these additional steps to fully preserve the historic, cultural, religious patrimony of the indigenous peoples of our country. So I'm all in on the bills. I'm here for Native Hawaiians today because, in all honesty, I have a sense of frustration that these bills, for whatever reason, do not encompass Native Hawaiians. This has been an effort throughout the last couple of Congresses, and I feel like I have had to come to this committee, my committee, and to the Native American, Alaska Native communities, and to the Department of the Interior too many times now to say, well, you know, these are all great ideas, but what happened to Native Hawaiians? And so I'd just like to do a little refresher course here. Native Hawaiians are the indigenous peoples of our country whose origins are in Hawaii. They fit every category of indigenous peoples. President Sharp, to your testimony, they have a special relationship with the land. They have a special relationship with the federal government. They have their own land that comes from the federal government. And by the way, all land in Hawaii originated with the Kingdom of Hawaii and previously with the prior incarnations of the Kingdom of Hawaii. All federal land in Hawaii originates with the Kingdom of Hawaii. It just transferred to this federal government at annexation. We have Native Hawaiian organizations in Hawaii that are the equal of any Native American or Alaska Native organization anywhere. The Office of Hawaiian Affairs now has a net asset position of $750 million. So this is a real community. And they have all of the same concerns and questions with the maintenance and protection of their patrimony. Mention was made of petroglyphs at the Gila River. We have petroglyphs. We have heiau. We have archaeological sites that are threatened right now because they're not fully under Native Hawaiian control. And so we need the same things that this bill provides for Native Hawaiians. And unfortunately, the pattern too much of the time has been Native Hawaiians are a little bit of an afterthought. And so the Native Hawaiian community and others have to come forward and basically include them. We've had this debate, this Congress, with the RESPECT Act for basic federal consultation. We think we've worked that out. We're having it right now with the Truth and Healing Commission for the Indian boarding schools. We had Indian boarding schools in Hawaii, and yet Native Hawaiians are not part of the proposed commission. That's inexcusable. We welcome Secretary Holland's decision to include a specific Native Hawaiian channel in co-stewardship of federal lands. So here's the bottom line. I'm really tired of having to come back and try to include Native Hawaiians all of the time. And so that's a little bit of, I'm just putting it on the table here. I don't want to do this anymore. I want bills to come before us that include Native Hawaiians. When they talk about Native Americans and Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians are there too. And if there need to be special, adjustments for Native Hawaiians, that's great. We've had 40 plus years of great partnership where we have helped American Indians and Native Alaskans and vice versa. And we've all been in this together. So that's a prelude to a pretty straightforward question. And I'll start with you, Mr. Newland. Is there any policy reason whatsoever why Native Hawaiians could not enjoy the same benefits of these bills as is proposed for American Indians and Alaska Natives?
Congressman, as it relates to the spiritual and religious practices and the cultural values of the landscapes in Hawaii to Native Hawaiian people, certainly there's a desire to protect those interests and make sure that we're being respectful of those religious practices.
Okay, so there's no policy reason to exclude Native Hawaiians from the provisions of these bills, the proposals. So in other words, very specific now to the tangible protection of Native Hawaiian patrimony on federal lands. That's what these bills are about, right?
Yes.
Is there any reason to distinguish between American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians from that perspective?
Congressman, I think that to the extent that the language in the bill refers to federally recognized tribes and tribal governments, that's based upon their unique legal status, which is different from the present-day legal status of Native Hawaiians. But as it relates to the cultural and religious interests and values, those are very similar.
Okay, my time is up. I'll submit the request for the same question and answer with you, President Sharp. I would note that we have solved that federal recognition issue in lots of other bills. I don't think that's a good enough reason. Okay, thank you very much. But we'll follow up. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and we thank the gentleman for his passionate advocacy. The chair will now recognize Mr. Obernolte from California.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Newland, I have a question for you. I represent a very rural district and a district that has one of the largest prevalences of wildfire in the country. So it's something that I am continually concerned about. You testified in support of H.R. 8109, and one of the things in that bill that I have a concern with is that it would establish substantial barriers to vegetation management to prevent wildfires. You also submitted written testimony on H.R. 8719 that would apply a wilderness designation to additional 60,000 acres in Arizona. Do you share my concern that those provisions of those bills would make it more difficult for the department to manage wildfire risk in those areas?
Thank you, Congressman. As it relates to 8109, I believe that that's something that could be addressed. I think that tribes have share the same interests in preventing catastrophic wildfires.
Okay, I mean, there's a section of the bill that says that vegetation management permitted shall be subject to regulations, policies, and practices and only necessary to protect or maintain or enhance tribal cultural areas, right? So, I mean, you can understand why my concern would be elicited by that.
I do, Congressman. I'll add that we support the overall goal of making sure that we have the tools to protect the unique interests of tribes and indigenous people in these landscapes, and are willing to work through some of the technical aspects of the legislation to address things like this. I'll reiterate, I visited California this summer in the Tule River Reservation in the Central Valley and saw the impacts of drought and wildfire near the reservation, and was also impressed by their work, despite all that, to protect the sequoia forests on the reservation. And I think
to be clear, though, sir, what I'm concerned about is that these bills don't give even the tribes the ability to manage the wildfire risk in these areas. Well, let me give a specific example. So H.R. 8719, which applies a wilderness designation to 60,000 acres in Arizona, would restrict the use of some of the practices for managing wildfire risk that have been successful in other places in the country. And I'll give you a very poignant example. Just from this last week, in my district, we had a fire ignite in the southern edge of my district. The Radford Fire actually came within a couple of thousand feet of the community that I live in. And I'll tell you, that's a pretty poignant experience to watch, a flame front advancing towards your house. I had a discussion with the incident commander in which he told me that had the community, the National Forest System, CAL FIRE, and local fire agencies, had they not invested in the last couple of years in efforts such as mechanical thinning, some prescribed burning, the creation of fire breaks, and the cutting of some access roads. Had that not been done, they would not have been able to stop that fire, and my house would be a pile of ash today. So, I mean, you can understand why I'm so concerned about that. Sir, none of those activities are permitted in wilderness areas. So you can see why I'm concerned about the fact that locking up an additional 60,000 acres with a designation that prohibits those kinds of fire risk management activities, would be concerning. So, do you share those concerns?
With respect to 8719 and the specific characteristics of the proposed Gila Bend area, I would have to defer to my colleague from BLM, but I can say, Congressman, overall, and as it relates to 8109, I think tribes share the same interests that you're articulating this morning, and we would be happy to work with the subcommittee on how to account for that, to make sure that there's proper fire management and collaboration in the stewardship and protection of those lands.
All right. Well, I mean, I think we all share on this subcommittee a common goal of making sure that the tribes have access to those lands and a voice in managing those lands. And we all share the goal of wanting to be good conservators of our public lands. But the problem is we don't want to create restrictions that explicitly disallow the kind of activities that have been successful in managing wildfire risk, be it for the tribes or for anyone else. And those are the concerns that I have with these bills. But I thank you for your testimony. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Ms. DeGette for 5 minutes, if she's with us virtually.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. We heard today about how efforts to protect cultural resources will also protect the conservation and ecological values of the lands. And so I want to ask you, Mr. Newland, how does the protection of cultural sites and the incorporation of traditional knowledge fit into the administration's vision for equitable conservation and land management?
Thank you for that question. We are working to make sure that we are incorporating indigenous knowledge into the knowledge base that we use for land management practices. That's a big part of our co-stewardship work. And I think if you'll allow me just one more moment to build upon that, it's important that we explain that co-stewardship is not simply a benefit to Indian people or for Indian people. It's actually a benefit for the American people because it allows us to take advantage of that experience and that knowledge built up over centuries and millennia and include that in our federal land management practices. So as the example I was referencing earlier, my visit to the Tule River Indian tribe in California, to see how their work within their reservation was successful in guarding against a catastrophic wildfire that would have destroyed these ancient trees on the reservation. Those are the types of knowledge and practices that we can incorporate into our work at the department through these co-stewardship agreements.
Yes, I agree with that. And that kind of leads me to my next question, and it also refers back to what Mr. Obernolte was talking about with wilderness areas, because everyone on the committee knows I've been working for over 2 decades to protect some of the most ecologically rich wilderness in my home state of Colorado with the Canyon Country Bill, the Colorado Wilderness Act. But these lands are also the ancestral homes of indigenous people. There's Papoose Canyon and Ponderosa Gorge that were inhabited by the Puebloan people. And there's Little Book Cliffs and others. 2 summers ago, I was in Little Book Cliffs riding around on a horse looking at the area, and we just came upon so many artifacts and different kinds of remnants. So my question is, how can the system that's created by HR 8109 work along with existing land management designations like wilderness areas?
I'm sorry, Congresswoman, could you repeat the question?
Mr. Newland?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's many areas, both in the chairman's bill and in other bills, like my Colorado Wilderness Act, that have certain land designations, wilderness areas, wilderness study areas, but yet they have strong artifacts and remnants of these ancient people. So the question is, how can we make sure we work together with the tribes as we protect these very important cultural areas, but also some of the wilderness areas and the other designations?
Well, again, I think there's been a lot of discussion this morning about tribal consultation. That's something that we are working on across the department and really across the administration. So as we're making decisions on land use management or designation, that we're doing it in consultation with tribes, and this co-stewardship initiative through the Joint Secretarial Order is aimed at making sure we're bringing tribes into the actual management discussions for these land units.
Yeah, and, Mr. Newland, let me just say, and I think you don't even have to answer this, but the tribes, and you pointed this out, they've been dealing for centuries with wildfire management on these lands. And I kind of resent it when some of my colleagues from other parts of the country just have a blanket objection to wilderness because of fire protection. Because in many of the areas, like in my bill and in Arizona where the chairman lives, the real issue is protection of these very fragile areas. Fire management is important, but it can be done within the constraints of the various designations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Gohmert for 5 minutes if he's with us virtually. All right. The chair will now recognize Ms. Ledger-Fernandez for 5 minutes, the chairwoman of the Indigenous
Thank you so very
Subcommittee.
much, Chair Neguse, and thank you to our witnesses. It's nice to see you again, Assistant Secretary Newland. And I really want to give much gratitude to Chair Grijalva's extensive work on these bills to support tribes' management of cultural landscapes and sacred sites. These efforts complement and will provide the congressional support that's needed to support the executive order and this desire that we hear, I think, universally expressed to incorporate and build upon and learn from traditional environmental knowledge, ecological knowledge, right? There's so much there. In New Mexico, the protection and management of cultural sites is one of the most cited issues when I am out visiting with the Pueblos, Apaches, and Navajos. That comes up over and over again. That's why I introduced my Safeguard Tribal Objects of Patrimony Act, to make sure that patrimony is not stolen and taken out of the country, and also to get our tribal our TIPOs more support in the tribal historic preservation officers, the support they need. But, what we also have happening in New Mexico is vandalism at federal sites. We've heard, I'm sure heard about the petroglyphs at La Cieneguilla, the vandalism, the defacement that happened there. Just three acts within 1 year. We've seen vandalism at Bandelier National Monument, and these are horrific acts of vandalism with swastikas, pentagrams, and ethnic slurs. So, Mr. Newland, would you first share what you and your colleagues are doing to combat crimes to tribal cultural resources? Can you share that with us? And I'm sure you're going to say that you're going to commit the agency to dedicate all of its resources to make sure that we don't see a continuation of these kinds of acts of vandalism?
Of course. Thank you, Congresswoman. It's great to see you as well. One of the things that we want to do across our land management agencies is to make sure that we are building that relationship with tribal governments that allows for this type of collaboration. Historically, at the department, there was often an over-reliance on the Bureau of Indian Affairs to do the Indian stuff, work with tribes. And one of the great things that I've seen happening under this administration and with Secretary Holland's leadership is a real buy-in from the other land management agencies at the department to build those relationships. And that will help in the protection of these sacred places. Tribes are often reluctant to share information about cultural resources with federal agencies. So, going back to your question, one of the things that we're doing is building that trust across these agencies, not just within the BIA. I think that's evidenced by the guidance put out yesterday through the Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service. So that's a big area. And of course, the law enforcement investigations and responses to those are a big part of it.
Thank you. President Sharp, in your testimony, you discussed how American Indian and Alaska Native peoples have place-based communities and that their stories, relationships, they're structured on the landscape, right? And while the United States, as we know, broke many treaties, the United States could not break tribal cultural ties to their historic homelands. And I think this sort of highlights the importance of having bills that protect that. And, you know, you've heard me talk about what happened in New Mexico at these sites. Can you sort of help us describe how these bills, 8108 and 8109, would help improve protection of these sites, how you see that actually working on the ground?
Yes, the way I see it working on the ground, you're absolutely right. We do have this this timeless connection, spiritual connection to the landscape, and we even with the discovery of sacred objects and things within our own territory, we oftentimes lack the capacity to really do the necessary work to identify, protect, and secure those resources. And so bills like this will support our efforts to not only repatriate and secure and protect objects within our already designated reservations, but to do that in a holistic way, because we have lost much, and we are building capacity to as you said, the tribal historic preservation offices. And so it's a natural way in a government-to-government relationship to work with the United States to repatriate all of these objects that have been lost over time. So it's really complementary to the work that we're already doing.
Thank you. My time has expired, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Tiffany.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Newland, in your testimony, you mentioned that the region of South Central Arizona is one of the fastest growing areas in the nation. Recognize that's been going on for a couple decades. This bill, or the bill H.R. 8719, would create 2 national conservation areas and add thousands of acres of wilderness. Do you see these designations and restrictions as hampering that growth and development?
I don't believe so, Congressman. No.
So taking additional land out of the possibility of utilization will not restrict that growth?
My understanding, Congressman, is that these lands are already under federal ownership, but I would defer to my colleague from BLM to confirm that, if he's appearing with me virtually.
I think we've seen across the country, you know, whether it's out in California, Bay Area, places like that, as we've seen very restrictive zoning or whatever means is necessary to shut land down from being able to be utilized. It's actually driven up the cost of housing. And what is one of the #1 challenges for young people these days? It is being able to afford a new home. And I think the generation of our chairman, who is here with us today, they fully understand how expensive it has become. And why do they sometimes end up in their parents' basements, in the proverbial kid in the parents' basement? It's because they can't afford being able to purchase land. I think the National Home Builders came out with some stats that said that 25% of the cost of building a new home now is soft costs. It's made it much more expensive to be able to build a home. And as we shut down more land, do we continue or do we exacerbate that problem? Does the administration, Mr. Newland, do they support an increase in the use of renewable technologies, in particular wind and solar?
Yes.
So under this bill, it removes multiple use. How does this advance being able to have these renewable technologies that are so dependent on more minerals being produced to be able to advance these technologies? How does this bill help with that goal?
But I think, Congressman, there has to be a balance between conservation and development. We believe that this particular bill is part of that overarching goal, and the President and the administration have been clear about supporting the need for increasing access to the materials we need for renewable energy and manufacturing of semiconductor chips here in the United States, and we are working to balance all of these interests.
But this does the opposite. You said that the administration, and they have said those words, you are correct. They have said that they want to provide more access. This does the opposite. This provides less access. So is that striking the balance?
Again, Congressman, I believe that in this particular case, with the designations contemplated in this bill, is a part of finding that balance between conservation and protecting these special places, and also advancing the nation's goals to meet the climate crisis and develop the technologies that will help us do that.
Well, as we've seen in this committee, it doesn't matter where it is. Every place is deemed a special place in America, every square inch in terms of producing those minerals. They have been fought every step of the way throughout this subcommittee and this committee's hearings. President Sharp, I'm assuming the tribes that you represent, they believe in that goal also of we want to advance at renewable technologies?
Absolutely, yes.
Basically the same question. How do we get there if we continue to take more land out of multiple use and including mineral extraction?
Well, I think we need to start foundationally. There's a finite amount of land in this country, and within that finite pie, we have to prioritize sacred and special places that have existed for millennia, first and foremost. Then we can look at these other priorities, because these are special connections that have been lost. And as we renegotiate our future and acquire those, we are finding that we not only protect and preserve the landscape for Native people, but for the United States, and quite frankly, to be leaders in the world on ensuring that we have a trajectory where we balance a way of life, human way of life, where we're not commercializing, exploiting, or in any other way gaining profit off of our lands. That's what's critical, and that's restoring. So yes, we do believe in renewable energy, but we also believe land is sacred, and we have a duty, a sacred duty to protect it.
Is there any place in America that it's safe to mine?
Just one moment. I'm going to let you answer the question, but we're out of time here, so you can go ahead and proceed if you'd like.
Yes, I would say that there are places, and as I said, the United States is a very powerful country and has grown to be an economic powerhouse globally because of certain activities. But we have to, as Assistant Secretary said, balance those interests. And so I do believe that there are places, but that is a decision with the United States. When it comes to our interests, the United States must respect and protect our interests. What you do with the rest of that pie, you have a duty, and a sworn duty, to uphold treaties and protect the relationship. But you also have discretion in the other parts of the pie, and we respect that.
And we have not heard that on this committee throughout this session of the Congress
Mr.
to
Tiffany,
be able to mine anywhere.
Mr. Tiffany, let you go
You've
over
given
by
me a
2
lot of
minutes.
extra time.
Yeah,
Thank
so,
you very much.
would
I'll
ask you-
conclude my remarks. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize himself just briefly for a moment. I would say first, thank you to the witnesses. I know we have one more member who's going to ask some questions of this particular panel. I do want to say, just to my colleague on the other side of the aisle's point, I am humbled by his identification of me as part of a newer generation, notwithstanding the gray hairs that I've developed during my time in Congress. I would say I certainly agree with his point more broadly around the need for us to invest in affordable housing and the challenges that are faced by millennials and younger generations in our country in terms of being able to acquire a home. With respect to the particular bill that the chairman has brought forward today in regards to wilderness, the YILA Bend Conservation Area, H.R. 8719, I thought it would just be helpful by way of context. I've never been there. Of course, I look forward to visiting the chairman's district in the coming years. But I thought it would be helpful to read a bit from the BLM's website about this particular conservation area, which I have not yet had the privilege of visiting. But just to give a sense for those who might be listening in, this region is an ecosystem abounding with plant and animal diversity. A canyon section known as the Gila Box is composed of patchy mesquite woodlands, mature cottonwoods, sandy beaches, impressive cliffs towering more than 1,000 feet above the Gila River, bighorn sheep commonly spotted. Bonita Creek, a key tributary of the Gila River, is lined with large cottonwoods, sycamores, and willows. The wildlife viewing area provides a bird's eye view of the canyon below. There are a network of primitive roads that provide hours of backcountry adventure for four-wheel drive and mountain bike trekkers. Rock art and cliff dwellings show evidence of the occupation of this important perennial stream by earlier inhabitants. That does not sound like a place where, we would be building a massive apartment building to address some of the housing challenges that we might have, or housing density that I think some folks might be interested in building. This clearly is an area that merits protection, which is precisely why it has been afforded some protection already under federal law, and why the chairman is championing this measure to go a step further. So I think that the pursuit of affordable housing and protection of our most sacred places in this country are not mutually exclusive. I think we can do both, and we've got to make sure that we find that right balance. So with that, I will yield back the balance of my time. I'll now recognize, unless there's a Republican member on our side of the aisle, I will recognize Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes. Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this hearing and for the good work that you do, and to our panel of witnesses for joining us and sharing your expert testimony. I'm proud to represent the Capital Region of New York, where I've seen the incredible value of cultural heritage sites that preserve regional history, instilling a strong sense of place in local communities, and provide individuals with a place to gather and reflect. However, for far too long, tribes have not seen their histories reflected in heritage sites across our country, and had a voice in, or had a voice in how these sites are indeed managed, despite the painful fact that these sites were built on tribal lands and that many continue to hold invaluable tribal artifacts, natural features, and stories. That is why I'm proud to co-sponsor the Tribal Cultural Areas Protection Act before us today to begin to right this historic wrong. So, Mr. Newland, how is the Department of the Interior working to integrate tribal heritage protections into existing management units, and how will the legislation that is before us today support and indeed strengthen these efforts?
Thank you, Congressman. The biggest and most important way that we're carrying out that work right now is under the Secretary's joint order with Secretary of Agriculture on co-stewardship and collaboration with tribes, and that was built out yesterday with announcements from other agencies at the department to put that into action on the ground. Going forward under this legislation, one of the things I want to make sure that I mention is that President Sharp discussed in her testimony that despite the fact that there are many existing federal designations and laws to protect heritage and historical sites, that there's often a gap, and that tribes are forced to try to fit their interests into existing laws that don't neatly fit their interests. And I had to go through that as tribal leader myself before I did this job. One of the things that this bill would do is account for the unique interests of tribes. And one of those unique interests is that the cultural values of many of these landscapes is not in the past. It's a present-day value. And I can give many examples, but where I come from in northern Michigan, black ash trees are disappearing because of invasive species. And black ash wood is important to a lot of cultural activities. Wild rice harvest is important to the carrying out of ceremonies today in modern times. as well as providing healthy food for tribal members today. And so HR 8109 would account for the unique cultural interests that tribes have in these landscapes today, not only their historic value, in their value in the tribe's history and retelling of its own story on earth, but in the work that Indian people do on the land today. And that's it. And I would never call myself a handyman, but I know that having the right tool is important to doing the job. And we have many different designations we can use, but this is explicit, 8109 for tribes, and we support that goal. And to the extent we have to refine that language in that bill, we're happy to do that.
Thank you. Thank you for your insight. And Ms. Sharp, do you believe there is an opportunity to improve the protection of these non-federal sites? Just how can the bills today serve as a model for what works?
Yes, thank you. I absolutely believe that they can serve as a model. And I guess if I mean, just in response to your question spontaneously, I think adding the recognition and deference of tribal traditional, historic, ecological knowledge, I mean, that deference is given, but creating meaningful ways in which we can bring that in a wide range of points of entry, if you will, to enhance this work. We really appreciate the opportunity to make that connection, but to be able to do it in a meaningful way that both supports us. As I mentioned, we are building capacity to identify those, but that's a couple of ideas I would offer. Thank you for the question.
Well, I appreciate both of you sharing your insight. It's important for us to be sensitized to all of the neglect, if we can call it that, of the past, and move forward with a sound plan for progress and incorporating the thoughts for the tribal communities. Thank you so much, and with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. We will now transition to our third panel. You are both free to leave. Thank you again for being here today. As with the first two panels, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be made part of the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start. It'll turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. As the other remaining witnesses come to the table, I'll go ahead and yield to the ranking member for a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a unanimous consent request in regard to a letter I'd like to submit for the record. Arizona State Land Department has submitted a letter in regard to the Great Bend of Gila Conservation Act, and they point out the creation of two distinct conservation areas and the conflict between the federal and the state management component. And I think that's important, as well as just understanding that we have a difference of opinion in what the word protection means, because we've been, and President Sharp and others have talked about how this needs to be protected, but where we truly believe, and there is another viewpoint, that by isolating it, it's not protecting it, it's actually endangering it from things like wildfire. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit a unanimous consent to the Arizona Land Department letter for the record, please.
Without objection, so ordered. The chair will now recognize, I suppose our two witnesses will be appearing virtually, the remaining witnesses, great. So the chair now recognizes Ms. Tina Marie Osceola, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Seminole Tribe of Florida, for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on H.R. 8108, Advancing Tribal Parity on Public Land Act, and H.R. 8109, Tribal Cultural Areas Protection Act. I serve as Director of the Historic Preservation Office for the Seminole Tribe of Florida. I speak to you today as a representative of the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, which is a national nonprofit 501c3 membership organization founded in 1998. Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, for sponsoring these bills. I appreciate your years of leadership in championing the creation of policies that tribal nations can use to protect and preserve our cultural resources and sacred places. Tribal Historic Preservation Offices are an exercise of tribal sovereignty. I am very proud to represent my TIPO colleagues. The mere fact that I am here before this committee to testify in support of these bills is a reflection of the resilience of the Seminole Tribe of Florida and the hundreds of other tribal nations throughout America. I am here despite a concerted effort on the part of the United States to extinguish my ancestors and our culture. The Seminole tribe members and other tribal nation members who were not killed were expected to just vanish, and our culture was supposed to disappear with us. Well, we're still here. And I and team members in tribal historic preservation offices throughout America are committed to preserving and protecting the cultures and the lands that were intrinsic to the lives of our ancestors. The Advancing Tribal Parity on Public Land Act and Tribal Cultural Areas Protection Act would strengthen laws governing the management of federal lands that are predicated on the belief that tribal nations and their cultures no longer exist. Well, we do still exist. And because the vast majority of what are now federal lands were carved out of the ancestral homelands of tribal nations, we have a special connection to these places. NAFPO strongly supports provisions in the Advancing Tribal Parity on Public Land Act that would prohibit the sale of public land containing a tribal cultural site where an Indian tribe retains treaty or other reserved rights, or that contains a former reservation. NAFPO also supports provisions in the bill that would make sure that tribal nations have the first opportunity to reacquire federal lands that have a historic connection to. Sadly, existing law authorizes the conveyance of public lands to state or local governments or nonprofit organizations for public purposes, but does not authorize the conveyance of public lands to tribal nations. Similarly, the bill would modernize existing laws that federal land managers to consult with state and local governments, but fail to require consultation with tribal nations. The existing laws reflect wishful thinking that tribal nations had vanished and need to be changed to reflect the reality that we are very much here and an integral part of our nation's story and existing culture. NAFPO strongly supports the provisions in the Tribal Cultural Areas Protection Act. This bill addresses an oversight in the law that fails to recognize and protect tribal interests in federal lands. Congress has established national systems of protected lands for parks, wilderness, and other purposes, but no such system exists for tribal cultural sites. The lack of a system has resulted in land managers permitting development that desecrates places that are culturally significant or sacred to tribal nations. It has also led to a system of managing these lands that unintentionally results in the theft of cultural resources and the wanton destruction of places that tribal nations revere. Congress doesn't tolerate the vandalism of churches or temples and shouldn't tolerate the destruction of places that are vital for tribal nations' understanding of their place in the universe. By creating a system of tribal cultural areas and empowering tribal nations to play a role in the management of these areas, this bill would make significant progress towards protecting tribal nations' cultural resources and sacred places. These bills are part of a movement to confront institutions, including the federal government, that do not value our living culture. These institutions have done their very best to erase our oral histories, our stories, our beliefs, ourselves, while at the same time asking us to validate what we believe in to justify our rights to our ancestral lands, practices, and ancestors. We are the only political group in the United States who are asked to validate who we are. My testimony on behalf of these bills is consistent with my efforts to pressure institutions like the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History to return close to 1,500 of our ancestors. NAFPO has submitted written comments, and we respectfully ask for your consideration and support of both bills and look forward to working with this subcommittee on any changes. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Stephanie Smallhouse, President of the Arizona Farm Bureau.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, Chairman Neguse, Ranking Member Folker, and members of the committee. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak today. My name is Stephanie Smallhouse. My husband and I currently own and operate a cow-calf operation in southern Arizona. We are the 5th generation on the ranch and hope to pass it on to the 6th. I am also the president of the Arizona Farm Bureau Federation, which represents more than 2,300 farmers and ranchers across our state. On behalf of those members, I appreciate this opportunity to express our opposition to Great Bend of the Gila Conservation Area proposed by H.R. 8719. Living and working in rural Arizona, I have a unique understanding of the environmental and cultural value that Arizona's public lands have to offer. I also have a unique understanding of the challenges that federal land use restrictions impose on those who seek to manage, steward, and produce a valuable food source on public lands.
Ms. Smallhouse, sorry to interrupt you, and we'll preserve your time. If you might turn your camera on, we're having a bit of difficulty seeing you. Terrific.
Can you see me now?
We can. You may proceed.
Okay. Sorry about that. Living and working in rural Arizona, I have a unique understanding of the environmental and cultural value that Arizona's public lands have to offer. I also have a unique understanding of the challenges that federal land use restrictions impose on those who seek to manage, steward, and produce a valuable food source on public lands. Federal law mandates that our nation manage its public lands for multiple use. Conservation area and wilderness criteria threaten the multiple use of public lands by restricting grazing, mineral extraction, and resource harvesting. They also prohibit the deployment of motorized tools and mechanized vehicles, severely limiting the effectiveness of watershed management, trail maintenance, soil treatment, noxious weed control, waste management, and fire protection. The proposed Great Bend of the Gila Conservation Area and wilderness expansion, proposed by H.R. 8719, would threaten sound management of an area that supports grazing, sand and gravel, saleable minerals, and contains transmission lines that may one day support renewable solar energy production. The area also overlaps with popular hunting and outdoor recreation areas already managed by state and local governments. By creating 2 new national conservation areas and expanding wilderness areas by tens of thousands of acres, this bill will remove options for sound land management and limit the scope of critical private partnerships. Moreover, the cultural and environmental resources contemplated by this measure are already under significant protection. Arizona is currently home to 24 national monuments and parks. Conservation areas in Arizona comprise more than 111,000 acres, a significant portion of the nearly 50% of Arizona's land that is federally controlled. Less than 20% of our state land area is privately owned, and this bill would increase federal land management by more than 430,000 acres. With private and state land already encumbered, any proposed expansion of federal land management is met with great concern for long-term environmental and economic sustainability. Finally, I have serious concerns about the impact this bill would have on livestock grazing. Public lands grazing is integral to ranches in Arizona and across the West. H.R. 8719 would restrict grazing within the conservation and wilderness areas to its current footprint, potentially leaving no room for expanding that footprint in ways consistent with environmental and ecological conditions. Livestock grazing is critical for managing and preventing invasive plant species, decreasing hazardous fuel loads, and preventing wildfires, supporting wildlife habitats, and cultivating viable rural economies. The restrictions outlined in this bill would severely limit the effectiveness of grazing as a critical land management tool, setting a dangerous precedent for future land use restrictions and threatening a critical aspect of our nation's food supply. Public lands are critical to the success of agriculture, and agricultural managers are likewise critical partners for the conservation of public lands. In relation to prior iterations of this bill, we have expressed serious concerns over the top-down approach to imposing restrictions with major impacts on our farmers and ranchers. The language in this bill is contrary to the extensive stakeholder process undertaken by the BLM to develop the Lower Sonoran Decision Area Resource Management Plan, which was developed in compliance with the Federal Land Management Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, NEPA, Archaeological Resources Protection Act, and multiple use policies of the BLM to include Native American Tribal Consultation and Section 106 National Historic Preservation Act. It's noted in the plan that considerations for selecting the approved plan, the BLM did not receive comments from tribal governments indicating that the proposed resource management plan and environmental impact statement was inconsistent with their existing policies and plans. While we remain opposed to H.R. 8719, we appreciate that we have now been given the opportunity to express our concerns about the expansion of wilderness and conservation areas. Furthermore, we remain committed to working alongside federal land management agencies for the benefit of all whose livelihoods depend on our nation's natural resources. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you for your testimony. The chair will now recognize members for questions. I'd like to start by recognizing Mr. Fulcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is for Stephanie, or Ms. Smallhouse. Thank you for your testimony. We're going through a significant inflation period right now. And one of the biggest complaints I know that I get in my state of Idaho has to do with the cost of energy and gasoline. So one of the things I'd like to get your perspective on is, in your testimony, you discussed some of the restrictions that H.R. 8179 would have on energy development, not just the development, but transmission, and particularly renewable energy sources. How do you think this legislation could impact Arizona's energy reliability and affordability, particularly when those prices have increased by about 19.8% compared to this time last year?
Thank you, Congressman, Ranking Member Fulcher. I have no doubt that it will impact. We're going to have an increasing demand on electricity, especially with the transition to electric vehicles. There are 2 electric districts included within the area of this conservation area, which have previously spoken in opposition to the creation of additional designations over this land area. I have no doubt that with the language of the bill and the way it's written, that will surely impact line maintenance, access to lines, and in the current resource management plan for the same area, there are 8 multi-use utility corridors identified within this area. That was certainly for a reason during the long process of developing that resource management plan, because folks anticipated the increased demand for power and the ability of this particular area to provide renewable resources. And it specifically states in the resource management plan, the current plan for this area, that there is great support for renewable projects and development of solar and wind projects. So in answer to your question, I have no doubt that the development of an additional layer of management and restriction on this particular area will have an impact on energy costs and the ability, especially of those districts that provide energy to agriculture in those areas and outlying areas, to provide that energy affordably.
So along that thought process, you'd mentioned the federal land ownership in Arizona, some 28 million acres, I believe, which is 4.5 million of which is in wilderness right now. You did touch on this, but I'd like you to expand a little bit further. Please discuss some of the unique challenges that brings to managing land for multiple use within the state when it's actually federally controlled. Ms. Smallhouse.
Well, yes, Congressman. I think there's no doubt the fact that when we have such a high amount of federal lands within the state, it's created challenges for managing the resources. Ranchers are required to follow all sorts of environmental laws, Endangered Species Act, NEPA, Federal Land Management Policy Act. The federal agencies continue to lack resources in terms of people and on-the-ground work to manage these lands, and so a lot of that falls on the rancher, and when they don't have the funding, then fences can't get built, things like that. So I think that's going to have an impact, and as well, it increases just an environment for litigation.
Okay.
In the few years, there have been several cases where ranchers have been litigated.
Okay, thank you. We've only got about a minute left, so I'd just like to hone in on grazing just a little bit. Grazing is a very important tool for preservation of prevention, of invasive species in Arizona. Buffalo grass is one of the primary ones. Left unchecked will dominate the desert landscape, enable regular, fast-moving wildfire. Please touch on that specifically and how H.R. 8719 and the prohibition of grazing permits, or there's certainly the great restriction on that, will have an impact on, what kind of an impact will that have on invasive species like buffalo grass?
Very quickly, grazing is an important tool to control vegetation. Buffalo grass requires very active management. It requires access to areas where there's buffalo grass. It's not something you can just lock the gate and pretend that it will go away. Intensive grazing before seed heads develop is very helpful for buffalo grass, and it's also helpful in basically avoiding fuel connectivity. Buffalo grass is very prone to wildfire, And the way to control that connectivity of the fuels is to have grazing as an active management tool in those areas.
Thank you. Ms. Smallwood, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Mr. Smallhouse, excuse me.
Gentleman yields back. The chair will recognize himself just briefly for a few questions. Ms. Smallhouse, thank you for being here and for testifying before the committee. I had a question. I'm not going to ask you about the particular wilderness piece of legislation. I think you've talked at great length about your position on the bill, and of course, Chairman Grijalva, who I know unfortunately can't be here for questions on this round, but has spoken previously about his reasoning for putting forth that bill. I wonder, there's been a lot of discussion about agriculture, grazing, as well as wildfire mitigation and resiliency and those efforts, all of which I certainly support, and I suspect most members of this committee support. I wonder if you might talk a bit about the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act and the impact that that bill that was passed by the Congress and was signed by President Biden into law last year will have on Arizona agriculture and on Arizona wildfire management.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I can. The infrastructure bill includes a lot of monies that we're hoping to use to bolster access to water and augment water supplies during the drought here in Arizona. It also included a lot of language and attention to wildfire, as you mentioned. The fact is that ranchers are one of the most critical players in planning for prescribed burning. And that is obviously something that is missing in today's wildfire management. It's very difficult to get prescribed burns planned. It can take up to 10 years, if not more. And this has to do with the layering of designations upon designation of federal land. It just makes it more difficult to do prescribed burning. And so we are happy that the infrastructure bill addresses a 10-year strategy and some funding for that. But if you don't have the ranchers on the land to assist with that, it's going to be very difficult to implement some of those practices.
Well, I want to say thank you, Ms. Smallhouse, first for your candid testimony, because I had reviewed a statement that you had issued on behalf of the Arizona Farm Bureau last year in response to the infrastructure bill, which is consistent with what you've testified to today. And so for your candor and for your support of that bill. And my colleagues on the subcommittee, I'm sure, are frustrated that I sound a bit like a broken record talking about the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, but it's just because it's going to have such a profound impact. It's already having a profound impact on the people of Colorado and on the people of Arizona, farmers, ranchers, those who live on the land, those who are working really hard in partnership with the Forest Service to implement the 10-year strategy, as you mentioned, that the Forest Service was able to launch earlier this year as a byproduct of the investments that we made in this bill. I know, that many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle didn't support that particular piece of legislation, but it was a really incredible investment for our country's future, and I'm grateful to you and to many others across the political spectrum in our country who supported that particular piece of legislation. With that, I want to thank the witnesses for being here. And I believe we have one more member that will engage in some questioning. So I yield back the balance of my time and now recognize the distinguished gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Harrell.
Hi, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And yes, I'm sorry for being in and out of here, but I just wanted to ask a couple of questions to Mrs. Smallhouse. And,
Ms. Harrell, if you could just take your mic on there. There we go.
Oh, I think it is on.
We'll give you some extra time. Is it on now?
It's on.
Oh,
Great.
okay. I think can we hear you? Good. All right, all set. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear it? Yes. Is that better? Okay, so thank you, Mr. Chair. And I was saying I apologize for being in and out of the committee, but I did have a couple of questions for Mrs. Smallhouse. And I'm actually concerned about the language in the three bills and what the impact, if it'll be a negative impact on critical industries to my district, like the livestock grazing on federal lands, which are actually already constantly under attack. I'm also concerned by the provisions in H.R. 8109 that it would create a de facto wilderness study areas. And we've seen over the years in New Mexico how the wilderness study areas have been abused by Congress. And even when land management agencies have deemed the study areas not fit for wilderness designation, it is still nearly impossible to remove these study designations from these areas. And so one of my questions, Mrs. Smallhouse, is, can you put on record for the committee some of the difficulties producers in Arizona have experienced with wilderness study areas and how they hamstring livestock producers in the West?
Absolutely. Thank you, Congressman, for the question. When you have a wilderness area, it becomes very difficult to do any kind of maintenance that you have required to do on your allotment. That includes road maintenance, which is very important for access to fence lines, watering infrastructure, different things like that. Just moving your cattle becomes very cumbersome. So in areas where wilderness areas exist, that's really taking a very important and valuable area of cellulosic production out of the food supply chain, because that's basically what we're doing with the ranching and the cattle and the grazing industry, is we're turning cellulose into protein. And so every area that's designated as wilderness basically becomes incredibly inefficient for use in that way. And I received multiple complaints from ranchers wanting to just access infrastructure to maintain it, and how difficult that could be.
Yeah, and you kind of hit the nail on the head, because I feel like unnecessary restrictions on federal lands really serve no purpose other than to harm the people and communities who actually rely on them. In my district, federal mismanagement of public lands under current law is making lands more fire-prone and putting undue burdens on livestock ranching permittees, like you just mentioned, and piling on more red tape will further exacerbate this problem. And for example, lack of forest management in New Mexico's national forests have made large sections of grazing allotments unusable, and therefore forcing livestock into riparian areas that are home to the endangered species.
Did I say okay?
And this overcrowding of livestock in the areas is putting the grazers out of compliance with their grazing agreements through no fault of their own. Mrs. Smallhouse, and I know we haven't got lots of time left, but have you seen federal mismanagement of public lands under existing environmental regulations impact your members in Arizona?
Absolutely. The fact is that, we have folks in these agencies doing the best that they can under the circumstances that they have, but they do not have the funding resources or the people to get out on the ground with the ranchers to ensure that there's a productive partnership. And when that happens, what you end up with is litigation. Folks come in without data, and they sue these ranchers on these federal lands. And the ranchers are not assisted through the agencies because there's not the resources there to help them. And so we're seeing a lot of ranchers lose their AUMs and their allotments. I would point out that just with the National Conservation Area to the east of this proposed location, when that national monument was created, the Sonoran Desert National Monument, over 7,200 AUMs were canceled and 95,000 acres were taken out of production just with the swipe of a pen with the creation of that monument. And so that's likely what we're going to see in other areas. But it really just goes back to the layering and layering and layering of federal regulation in terms of the Endangered Species Act, NEPA, all of these things. I believe the people on the ground are doing the best they can, both on the agency side and the producer side, but it's very difficult to work your way through the bureaucracy of the red tape. Adding more layers of designation just makes this worse.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more, and I think we need to be doing more to bolster this industry that is so vital to the American people. I think we're out of time, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes Chairman Grijalva for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. The question I have is having to do with historic preservation, and let me ask the witness on the pieces of legislation before us, and you gave testimony. The importance of those pieces of legislation as relates not only to restoration issues, but also into the process of assessment and identification of those resources. Talk about the work necessary in order to go through this identification process and how the tribes would be involved.
Yes, thank you, Chair, Mr. Grijalva. a lot of the work that the Tribal Historic Preservation offices do is directly under the National Historic Preservation Act. And the Tribal Historic Preservation officers have been faced with a lot of disparity ourselves, in the sense that we've been challenged with underfunding for years. And the National Historic Preservation Act and a lot of these projects on public lands require heavy permitting to be done to assess the cultural resources, and that work on tribal lands is done by the Tribal Historic Preservation officers. And then on federal lands, Tribal Historic Preservation officers and tribes are required to be consulted. Tribes are severely underfunded. About 5 to 10 tribes are added a year, and the funding for TIPOs, and the funding doesn't match that.
Yeah, and just to follow up, if I may, we've heard today, and we'll continue to hear concerns about how these bills might impact the management of other resources, access to those resources. The significance of ancestral and cultural connections to these landscapes have been low on the list of rationale to both study and protect. Do you think, if I may, that it's appropriate to protect tribal resources explicitly, as these as legislation does, as a primary use? Same witness.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know if you were talking to me. These bills, the reason why we support these bills is because they specifically protect sacred sites and places that are important to tribes. And there cannot be enough. And I heard a question of another witness earlier that was saying, aren't there enough laws? And I'm sorry, but I think there aren't enough. Could there be enough laws? There aren't enough laws. We're talking about more than 200 years of federal Indian policy that has been specifically drafted to take away sacred places, sacred sites, and to alienate the Native people and the indigenous people from these sites as a way of furthering genocide. That is as extreme as it gets. That's as real as it gets. So when you're talking about having problems with housing, having problems with, oh, I'm sorry, but our children have to be living in a basement. But we're talking about our children dying and an inordinate number of fentanyl overdoses. These types of things. We're talking about the trauma, intergenerational trauma, because these sacred places are being torn from us. The intergenerational trauma that we live with, I know what happened to my great-grandmother. I know what happened to my great-grandfather.
Thank you.
And their ancestors.
Thank you. I need to ask, I've got 2 seconds left, and I wanted to ask Ms. Smallhouse just one quick question, if I may, Mr. Chairman. I didn't want to cut off the answer, but I don't know, for some reason I suspect that we might...
Chairman's time has expired. I'm just kidding. We'll proceed, Mr. Chairman. As much time as you'd like.
That was a good one. Anyway, Ms. Smallhouse, I don't know why, but I suspect that we might disagree on the value of some of the designations we're considering today for the Great Bend at the Gila. But I wanted to ask at least whether for the Great Bend, if there are concessions that we could consider that would allow the Farm Bureau to support the legislation. Number one, if we put cultural resources and protection of those issues at the core of that, protecting that landscape, is there concessions that the Farm Bureau would ask of us or ask of the tribes in order to support the legislation?
I greatly appreciate that question, Chairman Grijalva. And in general, any of these designations that take in a wide swath of land area are something we can't support. What we have supported in the past is very specific protections around these valuable archaeological sites, because we believe that national monuments, national conservation areas were intended to be very careful, sort of like with a scalpel instead of instead of just a machete, in terms of you have to be very careful about where you put these designated areas. And in that sense, we realize the appreciation and the value of these cultural sites for Native Americans, but we don't agree with creating such broad, large areas and creating multiple layers of designation when you're specifically trying to protect a specific cultural site.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my apologies to the other witness for cutting her time off. I just wanted to get that one question in, and thank you very much.
The chairman yields back. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of this committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those questions in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, subparagraph O, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for those responses. If there is no further business, then without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
Chairman, that was a good one. You got me good on that.